Born at the height of the Second World War and educated locally, Brian Smith is the patriarch of a well-respected Southern Highlands dynasty. 4 generations of the Smith family have owned various properties in the Bowral area since the early 20th century and operated the very successful Highlands laundry and dry cleaning business since 1918. This is Brian Smith's story.
Hi, I'm Brian. I just got the ABE over bloody 80. I was born in 1940 on the 29th of February, which makes me much younger actually. Born in Strathmore Private Hospital, which is next to the police station in Bowral. My brother and sister, the older ones, were born there, and so was my younger brother, but my sister Helen, there are 5 of us. I'm in the middle. She was born in the Bowral Hospital. 1940 wasn't a very happy time, probably a little like things are now, or worse. World War II was on well and truly in Europe, and the Japanese were progressing around the Pacific, and my mother used to play every ABC newscast that came on with a band introduction to it. And I reckon I was 15 before that intro didn't give me the chills. I spent most of my time with my mother. My father enlisted in the army, but they had the dry cleaners and laundry business going, and it was doing some work for the Air Force that had a munitions tunnel in the old railway tunnel between Bowral and Mittagong. So he was deemed to be essential. So he then joined the voluntary Defence Corps, spent most of the war away and became an explosive expert. And his job, if the Japanese had landed, was to blow the middle out of the Mittagong airstrip and blow up all the bridges in the area. He had a shed full of explosives, didn't even bother to put a lock on the door, and there were guns of old black powder, gunpowder like they do in the Westerns, and the basket bombs from World War II, plus dynamite, gelignite, everything that would blow something. But he spent most of the time away, but one humorous side of this was, I remember he came home one night up the back steps down there. We lived in a pretty simple sort of a place. Had the army hat on, and he took that off and hung it on the hook, hung his 303 on another hook, put his army greatcoat on another hook, and then said, "G'day, Claire," and that was the greeting he got when he came home. And my mum always made a cup of tea. The first thing ever happened, she always made a cup of tea. Anyway, they sat down and she said, "I think Danny's getting the eggs again." Well, down there was a paddock behind our place, and this old fellow lived down the back, and I won't mention his name because there's quite a few of his descendants around here who are respectable people, but he'd take the leg off a chair, he'd take anything. And my dad said, "I'll fix him." And at this stage was just after the Japs came into Sydney Harbour and everybody's on edge. And he had 2 massive bits of steel down the backyard, parts of an old boiler. And he put explosives between them, and he'd put trip yards, wires all around the yard. And about 4 o'clock in the morning, there was this almighty roar as the explosives went off. And the more louder part of it was when the top bit of plate came down and landed on the other bit of plate. And Denny didn't go out through the door of the chook yard, he went straight through the wire netting and was never seen back at our chook yard again. But next morning, the old sergeant was down there in his Harley Davidson saying, "There's reports of an explosion down here, Bob." My dad said, "Yeah, I heard that too. I wonder what it was." But yeah, we lived in pretty tough times, and my father wasn't a really easy man to get along with a lot of the times. In 1943, when I was 3 years old, the Volunteer Defence Corps was up the top of the jib firing shells straight over the top of our place into the bush, the other side of Mittagong. They were only practice rounds, they weren't exploding there, but you'd hear these shells screaming over the top. And at 3 years of age, I'd had enough. And I crawled up under the floor as far as I could under the old laundry and sat there, and I wasn't going to get taken by the Japs. And an hour later, everybody in the district was looking for me. And I still remember the police used to have a metal badge on their cap, and this big blue arm got up, grabbed me by the shirt with his hat badge glistening, pulled him out and said, "I got him." And he dragged me out, and my mother burst into tears and went to pick me up. And my father said, "Leave him there, get up to the house." And I just marched off. I was still pretty well steamed up and couldn't care less. And then, my dad, I think, gave a bit of a speech and thanked everybody. But my older brother tapped on the bathroom window where I had to go. I opened it, he said, "You're not getting any dessert either." That cracked me up. I started to cry. But lunch that day, I got more than anybody else. But anyway, the war went on, and finally we won. I still remember the day, about 11 o'clock in the morning, everybody crowding around the radio in the old factory saying that the Japanese had signed the armistice, and that was it. And that was 1945, that was the time I just started going up to St Joseph's Convent in Mittagong. My older brother and my older sister and I used to have to walk the 1.5 miles, except when it was raining. And in those days there was a lot of competition between the public schools and the Catholic schools. And I had to run the gauntlet of some people. And my sister was pretty good with a suitcase full of books. She'd let fly with it and belt them over the head. But I survived. I went from there to Chevalier. I was never a great student, although in primary school they did jump me up one class. I reckon I knew enough to go up further, which made me young to be in secondary school. I was a day pupil there, used to go by bus every day. My older brother was going there, and the teachers there were mainly young men who joined up to go and be missionaries, but instead of that, they made them teachers. I remember this in third year, because you used to do 5 years then instead of the 6 they do now. This nice guy came in his black outfit and said, "Good morning, boys, my name is Summerhays." He said, "They just told me I'm teaching physics." I said, "Never did it at school, wouldn't have a clue, we'll learn together." And the output of the school was not good at all. But my other brother, Robert, or everybody called him Algie, he died 2 years ago, but he ended up being an eminent surgeon. And in the leaving, he only got 4 Bs, which is as low as you could get. And he did another matriculation exam, got into Sydney University, became a dentist, worked in the army for a year, and then went back and did medicine, then went to England and got a fellowship in surgery, but he couldn't have got anywhere near the university that he got in those days. And I didn't like school, I didn't like teachers. Remember the first day at school up at the convent, there was this nun, they used to call her Teresa or something, everybody used to call her Sister Kerosina, and she had a florid red face and a ruler that long, and there was no paper then. They had slates with little bits of slate pens to write on them, and she wrote from 1 to 10 on the blackboard and said, "Now, copy that, but when you do 5, don't do that, do that, and put a tail on it." So I was very meticulous, did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I did the 5 so neatly you couldn't see where I joined it. And I had my hand on my desk, and she said, "I told you not to do it like that." I said, "I didn't." And she went whack on my knuckles with this big ruler. And I thought, well, this is the start of something I'm not going to enjoy. And I was made to board the last 2 years at Chevalier to get my leaving certificate. But there I enjoyed, I didn't play cricket very much because I lost that end off that finger when I was a bit over 3. A cricket ball hitting that, even anything now, hurts. Believe it or not, with my trim figure, I was a senior athletic champion. I love rugby, I played it, and as I say to my grandson here, I played rugby for quite a few years, and I broke 2 arms and a collarbone. Fortunately, they always belonged to somebody else, because I was pretty solid and pretty fast. I was in the cadets, and I went with 5 others to a camp in Singleton, and I topped the battalion, which included all the GPS schools in Sydney. When I got the leaving, I got a letter from the Army inviting me to become an officer in the Australian Army, and I didn't know at the time. We were building shops in Barrel there where the ANZ Bank is, Highlands Arcade, and I was working there for 3 years. And my father intercepted the letter. I didn't see it for 5 years, which I was fairly put out about. My brothers and sisters were all very upset about that particular thing. I went to Sydney University, and my dad was a fanatic about education because he left school when he was 11 and had a very basic bit of education. And my older sister Margaret, she became a Bachelor of Fine Arts and taught English and Arts in Sydney. Algie, he became the doctor and the dentist, etc., etc. And my father said, well, you're going to university, what are you going to do? And it was already sort of preordained that I was going to go into the business. I was working there from the time I was about 12 doing things. And I said, oh, economics, you're righto. So I got the leaving and I went down staying at St John's College in Missenden Road. The first morning I met up with these 2 guys walking over to the economics building, and we sat down together, and this lady came in with an academic gown on and started to chat and do things. And I said, what's she talking about? I said, did you do economics at school? I said, they didn't even teach it. They said, well, you haven't got a chance. So I thought, oh, well, I'll have a year in Sydney and do something else. Anyway, I went through it. The final results came out. I got a pass in economics, a post which was sit again in another subject, and a fail which I could have carried. And my father said, well, you better get back to the books. I said, no, I'm not going back. And then I started to work full-time with the industry. My first job, he'd bought a second-hand boiler about a quarter as big as this room. It was a monster of a thing, off the dairy farmers in Moss Vale, and he said, go up and take all the brickwork out of that. So I used to take off my old second-hand Army Chev and work there from 8 o'clock till 6 o'clock, and I'd come home and all I had was 2 white eyes, getting all this, stripping this boiler out. When we moved it down and got it going. And the business it was going, but World War II took a tremendous hit on everything. I remember my grandparents retired in 1935 and moved to Cronulla, but they came back up and worked and lived in Mittagong with us while my father was away, to the point where his father was known to us kids, my brothers and sisters, right to the time he died, as Other Daddy. Because he was the surrogate dad sort of thing. I had a good mate who was a chemist in Mittagong, and I used to go down, he worked at the pharmacy, he didn't own it. I used to go there about 5:25 and talk to him while they used to pick up syrup and water and count pills in those days. And with him he'd go up and have a couple of beers at the pub, and he said, you want to go to basketball? And I said, no, women play that. And he said, no, men play it too. I said, why do you ask? He said, oh, this fella said they're short a couple of players and they like 2 players. And I said, oh, yeah, I'll give it a go. I'd never seen basketball played. So we put the silky pants and the singlet on. I went up to Moss Vale, and about 5 minutes into the game, the ball's in my hand. I tucked it under my arm. A bloke came towards it. Forgetting I wasn't playing rugby, I flattened him, and the ref blew the pee out of the whistle. I said, I think you need a bit more help. And Lynn was a very good parcel player, and she started to coach, and that's how I met her. We married in 1964, and our wedding reception was at Craigieburn, and that was why the business started, was Craigieburn. Lynn used to work in the pharmacy in Mittagong, and I was working for not a lot of money for the business, but we took off up to Surfers Paradise, where everybody used to go in those days, in my second-hand Holden. And where we were staying the first week was £20 a week, right in the middle of Surfers. And I went and saw the manager after the first week. I said, I'm sorry, I can't afford it, because we'd already gone for a drive down on Paradise Island and got a place for 15 quid a week. And I said, I can't afford it, I'm going to have to go. He said, well, you can have it for 16 if you want. And I said, no, I said, I've already committed myself down there. So off we went. And there was a fella who owned it. He was an Englishman. He'd had a bad heart. And I helped him put some moorings out in the river. There were tins full of concrete with chains on them. And at this stage I was doing a fair bit of building, and as one chain went over, it took a hunk out of the back of my hand and the blood went everywhere, and he nearly fainted. I said, don't worry about it, she'll be right. And we're packing up to come home the following Saturday morning so we could be back at work on Monday. And he came up and he said, oh look, he said, I've had a talk to my wife. He said, this is not booked for next week, you can have it for nothing. I said, well, thanks very much. I said, but I've got to get to work. We didn't have, I used to work 6-7 days a week for years. And an interesting little facet of that place we stayed in, there was an old couple staying next door, and he'd been the headmaster of Mittagong Public School while my mum was a teacher there. We got up to 1969, Mandy was born. 4 years later, Linda came along, and Tim arrived about 18 months after that. I thought, that's enough of this. We lived in a little house in Cavendish Street, which is part of the land the laundry was built on. I built a little weatherboard place there, but then we were playing cards one night with these doctor and another fella and his wife, and the doctor's wife, well, they had 6 kids, and she could spend money like it was going out of fashion. And she said, Peter's got a bill for his provisional tax. She said, I think we'll have to sell that block of land in Spencer Street. And I said, whereabouts is Spencer Street? She told me. I said, oh, I'll give you £2,000 for it. She said, we'll never sell it for that. I said, all right, it's your deal. And he came and saw me on Monday. He said, were you serious about what you said to Mary? I said, what did I say? I didn't know if I'd put the hard word or something. And he said, about the land in Spencer Street. And I said, oh, yeah. I said, we'll have a look. We drove up there and it was all bush. I said, where's it start? He said, oh, that post there. And I said, where's it finish? He said, oh, he's a nice guy, but he was as vague as old blazes. Down there somewhere. And what about there? And he said, I think it's up near that black tree there. And I said, yep, I'll buy it. I had to borrow 1,000 quid. And that was that. Then I got it surveyed. And he was way out, there was 4 acres there. Went right up over the hill down to the creek down the back. So we built a house there. I built a tennis court and had it floodlit. We used to have long barbecues there. Lots of friends used to come around on Sunday and had a big brick barbecue out the back, which burnt I don't know how many tons of meat on. Every Sunday or Saturday, I'd buy a cabbage and make coleslaw. The only trouble was there was a lot left over. So I'd have a sandwich for lunch and a coleslaw on it. Have dinner that night, coleslaw. Every time there's coleslaw through to about Wednesday, and in those days, it's reversed now. I used to get, as soon as I could see the pattern of the wallpaper on the wall, didn't matter if it was summer or winter, I was out of bed. And she used to say, why don't you stay in bed for a while? I said, people die in beds, it's not good for you. But I used to go and make her a slice of toast and a cup of tea. Anyway, I got sick of this coleslaw after a while, and I said one morning, I went out and made her a cup of tea and made the toast, put a big pile of coleslaw on it. And she said, I don't want coleslaw. I said, neither do I. You got the message? No more coleslaw. I struck up a friendship with a plumber who lived down the hill, and we went fishing a couple of times down on Jarvis Bay, and we had this big 24 by 12 tent, and 3 grandkids either side put the tent up and camp in the tent, and they reckon I snored, so I used to sleep in the car. And we ended up buying caravans down at Crookhaven Heads, and it was a marvellous place. There was about 6 vans in a row, and all the people about the same age, but 4 out of the 6 had a pile of kids, and we used to go down there fishing, prawning, barbecuing, and eventually, after a fair few years, I bought a house down there at Culburra, which we still own. But the time at Culburra Caravan Park, when the kids were young, was beautiful. I mean, only thing is, you come home Sunday night, you'd be so tired from fishing, you needed a holiday. Now the house is down there. We were down there last weekend. The boat's in the garage. It hasn't been out for 18 months, but it's there if you still want to use it. One day, friends of ours from Osvale wanted to know where a farm was here, which is one over the back here. So we jumped in the car, and I remember it was pouring rain, and drove down, and up here I saw a little for sale sign on. I thought, phase 4. And within, we took the kids to England that year, but I had a deposit in December 1987, and we came back and we owned it in 1988. And as I said earlier, this is where I had Ruthless and Toothless here first up, fencing and clearing, and they built the house. My builder, Ian, said, I'll have you in by the time you're 50. And I was 50 in 1990, and we're 2 months late. If I can give you a little bit of background on our business, my grandparents on my paternal side, Martha and Fred, my third name is Fred, they came out from England in 1909 for a better life in Australia and went to a property in Inverell as a husband and wife farm team. She was the cook and the cleaner, and he was looking after the gardens. My dad, Bob, was born in 1910, but Inverell, the climate was too extreme for them there, and it was also, in those days, a very isolated part of the state. So they got a job at Hopewood in Barrel, which was owned by a member of the Horden family, the large retailing group in Sydney. They had several big houses in this area. They used to come up here in the summertime to get away from the humid climate in Sydney. Martha, once again, was doing the cooking and cleaning, and Fred was looking after the chooks, etc. Uncle Jack was born 2 years later, and to top that off, another 2 years later, she had twins, David and Margaret, who was known as Madge, and which stretched the finances a fair bit. And there was a lady by the name of Mrs. Horton, owned Craigieburn. I've been told by several people who are now dead, she was a very good woman and a very good businesswoman business person these days, isn't it? And she financed them to buy this house in Old Barrow Road, which had an orchard and a chook run. And my grandmother was the business operator. She had the drive. My grandfather was more of an artistic sort of a fella and liked playing the piano and doing paintings, which were pretty ordinary. But he carved wooden rocking horses beautifully. So he was looking after the orchard where Winter's Carpets showroom is, and the chook run. And Martha started to do small work from Craigieburn down there, serviettes and small towels. They had donkey, I think they called it, as a cast iron stove, and they heated the flat irons on that and ironed everything out by hand. That progressed to starting a small building next to it where they put in bigger washing machines. They put in a ironer, which a roller, 4 rollers like that. The sheets would go through it and come out dry and iron the other end. And that was driven by a big steam engine, no electric motors in those days. And they had one person out in the bush with a horse and cart cutting wood to stoke the boiler. And actually they became fairly prosperous out of that because they expanded. They started to do all the linen and clothing for Frensham here in Mittagong, Tudor House in Mossvale, and my dad worked in the business there with them, and all the kids did actually, up till about 1934 when Jack split with the family. There was a bit of a family feud there, and he went to Barrel and bought with a partner Barrel Steam Laundry, and that's where Linda is now. That's where the dry cleaners are, in that property. David and Madge, my dad bought them off and stayed on. My grandparents went to Cronulla, and as I said, you know, they came back during the war to help out. David spent most of the war in New Guinea, and I don't know what happened to Madge. But then that laundry, by the way, was called Snowflake Laundry, and he put a small dry cleaning plant into Barrel where Highlands Arcade is now, and that was Barrel Dry Cleaners. And in 1950 something, I'm not too sure, he brought the dry cleaning back to Mittagong and changed the name of both of them to Highland Dry Cleaners and Laundress. And every second place is called Highlands something in this area, but we were the first Highlands business there. 1969, my father, who was heavily involved in the running of the hospital to the point where he had a brain tumour, and I'd been interviewed. He was going to get an MBE in the Queen's Birthdays Honours in June, but he died on the middle of May and never knew about it. But he virtually became full-time working for the hospital for the board, and I took over running the place. Bought Jack out, closed the business down because all his equipment was garbage, employed all his staff, and they all turned up the following Monday down in Mittagong, and there was one fella who stayed with me. The others put on a rebellious act at lunchtime the first day, and I've been told I was a firm but fair boss, but I fixed that up. I fired a lot of them, got rid of them. I don't decry anybody getting a good wage, but labour was getting more expensive and we had to get more automated. And we imported a lot of equipment from England, new ironing equipment, new washing machines where you just took 150 kilos of sheets at a time, went in wet, came in dry enough to put through the ironer. There was a fella who used to organise conferences, and he didn't pick places like Marrickville or Newtown. He used to pick places like Fiji and Honolulu. And we went up to Fiji, and I took the 3 kids up, and a friend of mine from Canberra, who was a partner in Canberra Steam Laundry, which was one of the biggest and most successful businesses in Australia. I walked in for a beer and he said, could I see you for a minute? I said, yeah. I said, yeah, g'day Dave, g'day Brian. What can I do for you? He said, buy me a beer for a start. So I bought him a beer and bought myself one. And he and his partner, Graham McGregor, between them had 4 sons. And he said, this is not me. He said, this is McGregor's boys and my boys are not happy the way you're competing with Alsco and a few of the big multinationals with garment supply and linen hire. They wanted to come into your area, and when they do, they'll have to compete with you. I said, I appreciate that, David. I said, but we don't go any further than the railway line at Marulan, and that's where you come to. I said, I get quite a few inquiries from Goulburn from hotels. I said, no, it's out of our range, we don't do it. I said, if you want to do that, I'm going to have to go to Goldman. He said, yeah, fair enough. He said, that's not me. He said, it's the boys. And I went back to my room that night that every time I get something going, well, something puts a fly in the ointment. And David was going to Chicago, buying new equipment. And I said, well, think about it, David, I'll give you a call when you get home. And I thought, that's it. I was 42, I think, 43. I've had enough of this. I'll sell everything. And then I had 3 kids to educate. I thought, no, I won't. I'll move the dry cleaning business to Bowral and sell the laundry. But that was a later decision. Anyway, he came back and I rang him up and he said, you made a decision? And I said, I have. And he said, what is it? I said, I'm going to sell out. And he said, you what? And I said, you heard me. And he said, well, if you tell anybody this, he said, I'll cut your bloody throat. We had a good relationship with these guys. He said, since I went to America and saw how on-premises laundries, that's laundries placed into hotels and motels, are gaining ground, he said, Mac and I have already signed a contract. We're selling out to a multinational. And I said, well, that's a turnaround. And he said, what are you going to do? And this didn't happen. I said, because I love building, and there's some beautiful old rundown homes in this area, the Victorian era. I said, I'm going to buy an old rundown Victorian home and bring it back to crystal clear originality and have a holiday, then do that again. And he said, that's what I was going to do. Anyway, they sold out, so I moved the dry cleaning business out of Mittagong and put it where it is today, in Bowral. Then spent every weekend, I had guys in there and we painted the place out and made everything good. And the 2 businesses went like a charm then. But then I put it on the market and nothing happened for about 4 months. And one day, this American walked in and introduced himself. And he said, I understand the business is on the market. And I said, yes. And after a bit of toing and froing, he bought it. He was a nice guy, but all he'd ever done, he'd been a weatherman for the US Navy and a real estate agent in Cronulla. And he nearly went broke. And he sold out to these other people from Wollongong, and they put in a lot more equipment, but their management was terrible, and they treated the staff like they were nothing. And it broke my heart to see people who've been working for me for 25 and 30 years being treated like animals. To the end, they all just left, and it closed down, and that was that. So business went on where I kept on with the dry cleaners, kept on improving. We switched from one solvent to another, which was a big step. And I had a manager who worked for me for 32 years, which gave me the freedom of what I wanted. Eventually, Linda approached me about buying the business, and I've spent some time helping her, advising her. She usually does the other thing anyway. I was in Rotary for 38 years. I was the president. I was this, that, and the other thing. The laundry was established in 1918, which makes it now 102 years old. I think it's probably the second oldest built business in this district. White's Menswear, I think, is older than it. What I didn't tell you, if I can just go back a bit, my mum was a pretty placid sort of a person, but she was a very strong person. She had to be for that first 5 years of World War II, my first 5 years. And 2 of her cousins off a farm down the coast were Spitfire pilots. And in Battle of Britain, they just flew out on missions and they just disappeared. They could be anywhere. They both killed, probably in the English Channel somewhere. And she hated aeroplanes. And a fella I met at the basketball, his parents were Latvian migrants, and he was a little bit older than me, and we were both talking about going into the Air Force. And he didn't have English. He had to go to Tech to get 3 subjects in his high school education he missed out on. And I had English, physics, chemistry, maths, ancient modern history and geography. I had everything there. I didn't know about this letter from the Army at this stage. And we decided we'd get into the Air Force. And if those days, if you weren't 21, you had to have both your parents' signatures, you had to have a reference from your school headmaster, a reference from a clergyman, and some other thing. I had everything just laid out of me. He went back and he got English and maths and another subject so he could apply. So rode off, got the application papers, went up to see the old priest, he signed it, went out to Chevalier, they signed it. And I thought I'll start on Mum first. And I said to her one day, I said, would you like to sign that, Mum? And she said, what is it? I said, it's an invitation to join, application to join the Air Force. And straight away she was on guard. And she said, what do you want to do in the Air Force? I said, well, preferably fly the Sabre jets, which was the premium fighter at the time, but I'll do anything. And she went ballistic. Said, I'll never sign that as long as I live. My cousins were killed. If I don't sign it, your father won't sign it. I said, oh, come on, mate, don't ever even ask me again. Well, that's that. And 8 months, and this other guy, that's right, they had to naturalise him as well. He came around one Saturday morning when the poster used to call around on Saturday. Look at it, I'm in, slapped me on the back. And he was in, I was out, I was green. And he used to keep in contact with me about what he was doing. And 8 months later, I think it was, my dad and I were coming home for lunch, and the ABC News was on, and the announcer said, this morning, a Sabre jet crashed from at Richmond. The pilot, Ava Sensenberg from Metagong, was killed instantly. I went, And I walked into the kitchen, and my mother said, well? And I said, well, what? And that was the end of the subject. They found out this guy was 6'6" tall, and 3 pilots had been killed. They were tall. They found out when they were bailing out, the canopies were cutting their heads off. But that was it. He got to do what he wanted to do, and I didn't get to do it. And we were up in Darwin on holidays, and there's an air museum up there, and they got a Sabre jet setting in it. And a ladder, you get up and have a look at the cockpit. And I had a look at it, I said, I couldn't even get my big backside in that thing these days, so that was the end of that. But that was just another thing that happened along the line. Anyway, by the time I was 21, I was too busy building and one thing and another. I think I met Lynette about the same time. As I said, we got married. And we've been married happily for 5 years. The rest of them have been all right. No, that's a joke. I was talking to a friend of mine who had a similar experience. That it's funny, when my father died, all the crows sat on the fence and waited for me to go broke. But it gave me the freedom to go forward. And this other guy, he had a father who had a business in Barrel, and the same thing happened. And I had a cup of coffee with him there a couple of weeks ago, and I said, I don't think I could swap much around if I had another go at life. I said, what I've done is good enough. And he said, me too. And here we are now, turn of the century. Suddenly it's turn of the century plus 20 years, and I'm still on the right side of the grass. I've got 3 good kids, a beautiful granddaughter, a great grandson, And there's a bottle of scotch there for when I wanted at 5 o'clock, and a fire to sit by. What else do you want in life?